Zhen Tian was a man of routine and quiet passions. At 61 years old, the retired geography teacher lived a life that balanced simplicity and purpose in Beijing, China. His days were often spent in quiet reflection or indulging in his love for nature, a passion he had nurtured throughout his life. For decades, he had taught at Beijing No. 5 Middle School, sharing his deep knowledge of geography with students who often found themselves captivated by his enthusiasm. Yet, it was his unwavering love for the natural world that left an even greater impression. This love extended far beyond the classroom, shaping not only his teachings but his entire way of life. The morning of September 30th, 2018, began as many others had for Zhen. He rose early, long before the sun had fully illuminated the city streets, and carefully prepared for the day ahead. His meticulous nature was reflected in every movement as he quietly gathered his belongings. On this particular day, he planned to embark on a day hike to Mount Mang, a location he cherished for its striking natural beauty. The mountain, located about 30 miles northwest of Beijing, was known for its ancient temples and the seasonal blooms of vibrant roses that covered its slopes. For Zhen, it was not just a hike but a ritual, a chance to connect with the world he loved so dearly. Zhen's preparations were deliberate. He packed light as he always did, ensuring he had the essentials: water, food, a well-read newspaper, and his unique diary, a collection of scrap papers bound together. He had always disliked waste, preferring to repurpose discarded sheets from his teaching days to document his thoughts and observations. To Zhen, these journals were more than a practical tool. They were a testament to his respect for nature and his commitment to leaving as little impact on the world as possible. By the time he stepped out into the brisk morning air, the streets of Beijing were still quiet, save for the occasional hum of early commuters. The walk to the train station was short but filled with anticipation. Zhen loved this part of his routine. The steady rhythm of his steps, the weight of his backpack on his shoulders, and the promise of the untamed wilderness waiting for him. It was a simple pleasure, but for Zhen it was enough. Mount Mang held a special place in Zhen's heart. Its trails, though challenging, offered breathtaking views of the surrounding landscape. On clear days, the summit provided an unparalleled panorama of downtown Beijing, its skyline a glittering sea of lights that seemed almost otherworldly against the darkness of the night. Though he often stayed overnight on the mountain to take in this view, today would be different. Time was not on his side, as he needed to return home that evening. The following day marked a significant occasion: his mother's 90th birthday, an event he would not miss for anything. The train station was just beginning to stir as Zhen arrived and purchased his ticket. He found a seat in a quiet corner of the train, setting down his bag and pulling out his diary. Writing had always been a way for him to reflect and to document his thoughts and surroundings. He jotted down notes about the day's weather and his planned route, taking comfort in the familiar act. Beside him, the newspaper lay neatly folded, its pages destined to serve as trail markers for his hike. This was another of Zhen's habits, a practical measure to ensure he could find his way back down the mountain, especially on less defined paths. As the train began to move, Zhen's thoughts drifted to the mountain ahead. Mount Mang was not just a place of beauty but one of history and mystery. Its ancient temples, scattered along the trails, seemed to whisper stories of the past to those who walked among them. The dense forests that blanketed the slopes held an almost sacred stillness, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of distant birds. It was a place that demanded both respect and caution, qualities that Zhen carried with him on every hike. The journey to Mount Mang required a transfer to a bus at the end of the train line. Zhen moved through the transition seamlessly, his mind already envisioning the trail ahead. The bus ride was short but bumpy, the roads winding through the outskirts of Beijing and into the countryside. Fields and low hills gave way to denser forests as the mountain came into view, its silhouette dark against the rising sun. By the time the bus reached the village of Chanfang, nestled at the base of the mountain, Zhen was ready to begin his ascent. Stepping off the bus, Zhen adjusted his backpack and started toward the trailhead. The village, though small, was lively with early morning activity. Farmers tended to their stalls, offering snacks and supplies to hikers passing through. The scent of roasted nuts and fresh bread filled the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of the forest beyond. The path ahead was familiar to Zen, a route he had walked many times before. Yet, as he approached the edge of the village, the forest seemed to stretch out before him like an invitation, its towering trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. The hike ahead promised hours of solitude and discovery. Zen welcomed the silence of the forest, the way it seemed to envelop him in its embrace. With each step, he felt a growing sense of peace, a connection to something greater than himself. The world around him was alive with subtle sounds, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant murmur of a stream, the occasional chirp of a bird high above. As the forest closed around him, Zen disappeared into the trees, leaving behind the noise of the village and the bustle of the city. Zen Tiam's journey to Mount Mang began with the steady hum of the train beneath him as he settled into his seat. The early morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the sparsely populated car. The train was a familiar companion on these excursions, offering Zen a quiet moment to reflect and prepare for the day ahead. He opened his bag with careful precision, extracting a neatly folded newspaper and a stack of well-worn scrap papers. His makeshift diary. Writing in his diary was more than a habit for Zen. It was a way to connect with his thoughts and the environment he adored. The pages were filled with observations, reflections, and notes from previous hikes. The rough edges and mismatched sizes of the paper seemed to embody his belief in practicality and his disdain for waste. Each page was a piece of his history, salvaged and repurposed from a previous life as a teacher. He began to jot down a few lines about the crisp morning air, the anticipation of the hike, and his excitement at revisiting the familiar trails of Mount Mang. The newspaper lay open on his lap, the ink slightly smudged from the moisture in the air. It was not for reading, at least not entirely. For Zen, the newspaper served a dual purpose. Its primary role was as a trail marker, a method he had devised over years of hiking less traveled paths. At intervals along his journey, he would tie a page to a tree branch, marking his route to ensure he could find his way back. It was a practice that offered him peace of mind, a safeguard against the unpredictability of nature. As the train rolled through the outskirts of Beijing, the urban landscape began to give way to stretches of green fields and clusters of trees. The distant outline of the mountains loomed on the horizon, their peaks shrouded in a light morning mist. Zen glanced out the window, his thoughts momentarily drifting to the view from the summit. He could already picture the sprawling city below, its countless lights twinkling against the darkened sky. Though he would not be staying overnight this time, the memory of those views filled him with a quiet sense of wonder. The train came to a stop at the last station, signaling the next leg of his journey. Zen rose from his seat, carefully tucking his diary and newspaper back into his bag before stepping onto the platform. The transition to the bus was seamless, a routine he had followed many times before. The bus station was modest, its benches filled with a mix of hikers and locals. The smell of fried snacks and freshly brewed tea wafted through the air, a small comfort in the bustling station. The bus ride was uneventful, the vehicle winding through narrow roads that cut through the countryside. Zen sat by the window, watching as the scenery shifted. Villages dotted the landscape, their rooftops peeking out from clusters of trees. Farmers worked in the fields, their movements deliberate and steady. The sight of the forest growing denser with each passing mile signaled their approach to Mount Mang. When the bus finally came to a halt in the small village of Chanfam, Zen stepped off and adjusted his backpack. The village, nestled at the base of the mountain, was a place of transition, a boundary between the civilized world and the untamed wilderness beyond. Vendors lined the streets, their carts overflowing with roasted nuts, dried fruits, and bottled water. The chatter of merchants and the occasional laughter of hikers filled the air, blending harmoniously with the rustling of leaves in the nearby forest. Zen walked through the village with a purposeful stride, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. The wooden signs pointing toward the trailhead were worn but legible, their surfaces smoothed by years of exposure to the elements. The path ahead, partially hidden by the dense canopy of trees, called to him like an old friend. It was a trail he knew well, its twists and turns etched into his memory through countless hikes over the years. The ascent began gradually, the ground beneath his feet transitioning from packed dirt to uneven stones. The forest enveloped him, its towering trees forming a natural cathedral. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy, illuminating patches of moss and fallen leaves. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of earth and pine. With each step, the sounds of the village faded, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the trail and the distant calls of birds. Zen moved with the ease of experience, his body attuned to the demands of the terrain. He reached into his bag, pulling out the newspaper and tearing off a page. Carefully, he tied it to a low-hanging branch, ensuring it was visible yet unobtrusive. It was a ritual that had served him well, a way of leaving a subtle trace of his presence in a place that often resisted human intrusion. As he climbed higher, the forest seemed to deepen, its shadows growing longer and its silence more profound. The trail narrowed, winding through rocky outcroppings and dense undergrowth. The occasional glimpse of the mountain's summit offered reassurance, a reminder of the destination that lay ahead. For Zen, the journey itself was as important as the goal, each step a meditation on the beauty and unpredictability of the natural world. The morning sun rose higher, casting a golden light over the forest. Zen pressed onward, his thoughts focused on the path ahead and the quiet joy of being immersed in the wilderness. The mountain, with all its secrets and challenges, awaited him. As Zen Tiang ventured deeper into the forests of Mount Mang, the morning transitioned into midday. The sun climbed higher, its rays filtering through the dense canopy above, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. The familiar sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls accompanied him as he pressed onward along the winding trail. The forest was serene, its stillness broken only by the crunch of his boots on the uneven ground. For Zen, this solitude was a source of comfort, a reprieve from the noise and chaos of urban life. The ascent grew steeper, and the trail became less distinct. Large roots jutted from the soil, creating natural steps, while loose rocks made certain stretches treacherous. Zen moved steadily, his experience as a hiker guiding each step with careful precision. He paused occasionally to take in the beauty of his surroundings. Clusters of wildflowers peeked out from the undergrowth, their vivid colors standing in stark contrast to the muted greens and browns of the forest. The air was fresh, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. As he climbed higher, the forest began to change. The trees grew taller and denser, their branches interlocking to form a thick canopy that blocked much of the sunlight. The atmosphere shifted, becoming cooler and quieter. The usual sounds of the forest seemed muffled, as if the mountain itself had decided to hold its breath. Despite the eerie silence, Zen pressed on, his focus on the path ahead. Around mid-afternoon, the trail narrowed further, winding along the edge of a steep incline. Zen paused to adjust his backpack, taking a moment to survey the landscape. In the distance, he could see the faint outline of the summit, its rocky peak jutting into the sky. Below, the forest stretched out in every direction, a sea of green that seemed to ripple in the gentle breeze. The view was breathtaking, a reminder of why he loved these solitary journeys. By late afternoon, Zen had covered significant ground. He stopped to rest at a small clearing, where a fallen tree provided a makeshift bench. Reaching into his backpack, he retrieved a bottle of water and a small container of rice and vegetables. The simple meal was satisfying, a welcome break before he continued his ascent. As he ate, he opened his diary and began jotting down notes about the day. His entries were detailed, capturing everything from the weather to the subtle changes in the terrain. Writing was more than a pastime for Zen. It was a way to preserve the moments that brought him joy. Once his break was over, Zen resumed his hike, now with renewed energy. The trail became increasingly rugged, forcing him to navigate around boulders and fallen trees. He paused occasionally to tie a page from his newspaper to a branch, marking his progress with a system that had never failed him. The ritual was methodical, a small but crucial act that provided a sense of security in the vast wilderness. As the sun began its descent, the shadows lengthened, and the forest grew darker. The light filtering through the trees took on a golden hue, illuminating the trail in patches. Zen checked his watch, noting the time. He still had hours before he needed to be back in the village, and his pace remained steady. He had planned his day carefully, as he always did, ensuring there was ample time for both the hike and the journey home. As the evening approached, the mountain seemed to take on a different character. The once inviting forest now appeared more imposing, its towering trees casting long, jagged shadows across the trail. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the air carried a faint chill. Zen adjusted the straps on his backpack, tightening them against his shoulders, and quickened his pace. The summit was no longer his goal. The focus now was on making it back down before nightfall. Zen's meticulous nature should have ensured a smooth descent. He had marked his trail, noted key landmarks, and left no detail to chance. Yet, as the minutes passed, the forest seemed to close in around him. The trail became harder to follow, its twists and turns blending into the surrounding wilderness. The familiar markers he had placed earlier seemed to vanish, swallowed by the dense foliage. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Zen had disappeared into the mountain's depths. The forest, once a place of solace, had transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and silence. The golden light of day was replaced by the dim glow of twilight, and the trail ahead faded into obscurity. Somewhere on Mount Mang, Zen's steady footsteps came to a halt, leaving no trace of his presence. Back in Beijing, the evening passed quietly. Zen's wife, accustomed to his punctuality, expected him home before midnight as promised. She went to bed with the assurance that he would return, as he always did. Yet, when morning arrived, Zen's side of the bed remained empty. The familiar sound of his voice, the quiet shuffle of his movements, were absent. The realization that something was wrong began to settle over the household like a heavy fog. In the days that followed, the serene beauty of Mount Mang would be overshadowed by a growing sense of dread. As the search for Zen Tiang began. The search for Zen Tiang began swiftly, fueled by the urgency of his unexplained disappearance. His family, aware of his dependable nature, knew that something was deeply wrong when he failed to return home. By the morning after his hike, concern had turned to alarm. Calls to relatives and friends yielded no answers, and the absence of any communication from Zen, a man known for his punctuality and reliability, was cause for immediate action. His family reported him missing to the local authorities, and within hours, a search operation was underway. Mount Mang, though not a towering peak, presented unique challenges for search teams. Its dense forests, twisting paths, and numerous cliffs made navigation treacherous. The mountain's reputation for beauty belied the dangers hidden within its sprawling terrain. The search effort was methodical, with teams combing the trails and surrounding areas. Despite their best efforts, no immediate sign of Zen emerged. Complicating matters was the discovery that Zen's cell phone had been turned off. Investigators contacted his service provider, hoping to use signal data to pinpoint his location. The results were puzzling. While the phone had indeed been active during his hike, the last recorded signal showed it at the base of the mountain at 4 p.m. on the day he vanished. This revelation conflicted with the assumption that Zen had been lost or injured higher up the mountain. The signal suggested he had already descended, further deepening the mystery. Adding to the confusion, Zen had received a phone call at the time his phone last connected to a tower. The call was traced to a friend who later told authorities that Zen sounded calm and mentioned he was coming down the mountain and would be home soon. This account clashed with the growing belief that something had gone wrong during his hike. If Zen had indeed been nearing the end of his journey, why had he not returned home? The lack of answers left investigators grappling with more questions. The search intensified as teams expanded their efforts beyond the main trails. Zen's family provided key details about his hiking habits, including his distinctive method of marking his path with newspaper pages tied to trees. This detail offered hope that searchers might be able to trace his route. However, despite scouring the trails and surrounding areas, no markers were found. The absence of these familiar signs was both perplexing and alarming. as it suggested either Zen had not used them or they had somehow been removed. Days passed with little progress. Search teams pushed deeper into the mountain, covering every possible route he might have taken. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the dense canopy for any sign of movement or disturbance. Villagers from Chanfang joined the effort, offering local knowledge of the terrain and its hidden paths. Despite their combined efforts, Mount Mang seemed to withhold its secrets, the forest swallowing any trace of the missing man. The absence of clues did little to dampen the resolve of those involved. Zen's family clung to hope, driven by the knowledge that he was an experienced hiker who had navigated challenging terrain many times before. Yet, as days turned into a week, the weight of uncertainty grew heavier. Every empty trail, every dead-end search brought a fresh wave of frustration and fear. The discovery of Zen's cell phone location at the base of the mountain offered a glimmer of possibility but no concrete answers. Investigators revisited the area, meticulously combing through every inch of ground near where the signal had last been recorded. Nearby train and bus stations were checked, but there was no indication that Zen had boarded a vehicle to leave the area. Surveillance footage from these locations showed no sign of him, leaving authorities with little to go on. The disappearance was unlike anything the search teams had encountered before. Mount Mang had claimed its share of lost hikers over the years, but there was always a trail, a clue, a path leading to answers. Zen's case was different. It was as though he had simply vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of his passage. As the days stretched on, the focus of the search began to shift. Mount Mang, once the presumed location of Zen's disappearance, now seemed less certain. The revelation of his phone's last known location raised the possibility that he had left the mountain altogether. Yet, without evidence to support this theory, search teams faced the daunting task of expanding their efforts while remaining tethered to the mysteries of the mountain. For Zen's family, the uncertainty was agonizing. The man who had spent his life teaching others about the wonders of the natural world was now lost within it, his fate unknown. The beautiful, serene forests he loved had become a source of fear and sorrow. Each passing day brought new theories but no answers. The search for Zen Tiang continued, each effort an attempt to untangle the web of confusion surrounding his disappearance. As the search for Zen Tiang stretched into its second week, a peculiar lead emerged, shifting the focus of the investigation. A villager from Chanfang, the small settlement at the base of Mount Mang, came forward with a story that seemed both mundane and deeply unusual. The man, who owned a small shop selling walnuts and other snacks to passing hikers, claimed he had encountered someone matching Zen's description on the day he disappeared. This interaction would take the investigation in an unexpected direction. According to the villager, a man resembling Zen had stopped at his shop early that morning. The man had purchased a small bag of walnuts and spent a few minutes chatting with the shopkeeper. At first, their conversation was ordinary, a brief exchange typical of a transaction. However, the tone of the encounter shifted dramatically when the villager mentioned something seemingly insignificant: the location of better walnuts. He told the man that the finest walnuts in the region could be found at Tia Mountain, another peak located approximately 30 miles away. The mention of Tia Mountain appeared to have an immediate and profound effect on the man. The villager described how his demeanor changed in an instant, as if the information about the walnuts had sparked an intense, almost urgent reaction. Without hesitation, the man abruptly ended the conversation, gathered his belongings and walked away, heading not toward Mount Mang but back toward the bus stop at the edge of the village. The villager watched him go, puzzled by the abrupt departure and the seeming importance of the walnuts. When authorities heard this account, they were initially skeptical. It seemed unlikely that Zen, an experienced hiker with a clear plan for the day, would suddenly abandon his intended route to travel miles out of his way for something as trivial as walnuts. Yet, the villager was adamant about what he had seen, and his description of the man matched Zen so closely that it could not be dismissed. What made the lead even stranger was the fact that Zen's family confirmed he had no particular interest in walnuts, nor had he ever mentioned Tia Mountain as a destination. The information added another layer of complexity to an already baffling case. If Zen had indeed diverted his plans to travel to Tia Mountain, It raised several questions. Why would he make such an impulsive decision? How could he have managed the additional travel time within the constraints of his schedule? And, most importantly, what had driven him to change his plans so suddenly? Investigators shifted their focus to Tia Mountain, hoping the new location might provide answers. Search teams were dispatched to the area, equipped with detailed maps and instructions to look for any signs of Zen's presence. The terrain of Tia Mountain was as challenging as Mount Mang, if not more so. Its trails were steep and often poorly marked, winding through dense forests and rocky outcrops. The mountain's remoteness and rugged landscape made it an unlikely destination for someone in a hurry, adding to the mystery of why Zen would have chosen to go there. Despite these challenges, the search teams began uncovering clues almost immediately. Scattered along one of the less traveled paths were pages from a newspaper tied to tree branches. The pages matched the type Zen was known to use for marking his trail, and the publication date aligned with the copy he had carried on the day he disappeared. This discovery rekindled hope that the search might finally yield answers. The trail of newspapers led searchers deeper into the mountain, winding through narrow passages and dense undergrowth. The path was slow and arduous, requiring careful navigation to avoid losing the trail. For 2 days, the search teams followed the markers, each new discovery pushing them farther into the wilderness. The atmosphere grew heavier with each step, the forest around them silent except for the sounds of their movement. The mystery of Zen's decision to come to Tia Mountain weighed heavily on the searchers' minds. The walnut incident, while seemingly trivial, now carried an inexplicable significance. It was as if the mention of the mountain had triggered a compulsion, driving Zen to abandon his carefully planned day and venture into unknown territory. Whether this decision had been his own or influenced by something else remained unclear. As the search teams continued their methodical advance, they were haunted by the thought of what they might find. Zen Tian's disappearance, once confined to the familiar trails of Mount Mang, had now expanded into something far stranger and more unsettling. The forest seemed to close in around them, its shadows stretching longer as the days wore on. The mystery deepened with every step, the trail of newspapers leading them toward an answer that remained just out of reach. For 2 days, the searchers on Tia Mountain followed the trail of newspapers left behind. Each page tied to a tree marked another step in the puzzle of Zen Tian's disappearance. The markers seemed to weave through the forest with no clear destination, winding along rugged paths and skirting steep inclines. The air was heavy and cool, and the dense canopy above blocked much of the sunlight, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly through the wilderness. The further they climbed, the more the forest seemed to grow unnaturally quiet. The sounds of wildlife diminished, replaced by an oppressive stillness that seemed to weigh on the searchers. The only noise came from their own movements, the crack of twigs underfoot and the rustling of leaves as they pushed through the underbrush. Each newspaper they discovered brought them closer to a potential answer, yet the atmosphere grew increasingly unsettling. On the 3rd morning, the trail led them to a small, secluded clearing high on the mountain. Here, among the tall trees and uneven terrain, they found what appeared to be a makeshift campsite. A bed of hay was arranged neatly in the center, flanked by a few empty water bottles and crumpled pieces of paper. Nearby, a scrap of cloth hung from a low branch, fluttering gently in the breeze. The site had an air of abandonment, as though its occupant had left in haste. The discovery of the campsite raised both hope and questions. It seemed likely that Zen had been there, and the arrangement of the items suggested he had spent at least one night in this spot. As the searchers combed through the area, they found a plastic bag tucked near the bed of hay. Inside was a folded piece of scrap paper, its edges worn and stained from exposure. The note written on it was unmistakably in Zen's handwriting, and its contents were both revealing and perplexing. In the note, Zen wrote that he had ascended Tia Mountain on the day he disappeared but had gotten lost while descending. He mentioned setting up the campsite to spend the night, intending to follow the ridgeline the next day to reach a nearby village. The final lines of the note read, "Leaving this note here just in case. Love to everyone who passes by." The discovery of the note was bittersweet. On one hand, It suggested that Zen had been alive and capable of making decisions at least a day after his disappearance. On the other, it raised new questions about the timeline of events. According to phone records, Zen had taken a call at 4 p.m. on the day he vanished, during which he told his friend he was descending Mount Mang and would be home soon. Yet the note indicated he was already on Tia Mountain miles away by that time. This discrepancy cast doubt on the sequence of events and added another layer of mystery to his disappearance. The language of the note itself also drew scrutiny. Though written in Zen's handwriting, the tone and structure seemed uncharacteristic of him. The use of third-person phrasing, such as "Zen got lost," was unusual for someone describing their own situation. Even more puzzling was the final line, which, when translated back into Chinese, sounded awkward and unnatural. It was as though the note had been written hastily or with deliberate ambiguity, leaving room for interpretation. As the searchers analyzed the note and the campsite, the forest seemed to close in around them. The oppressive silence deepened, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The discovery of the note had provided a glimpse into Zen's fate, but it was far from a complete picture. If he had intended to follow the ridgeline to safety, why had there been no further signs of him? Had he been injured or had something or someone intervened? The questions lingered as the search continued. The team expanded their efforts outward from the campsite, following potential paths Zen might have taken. They scoured the surrounding area, searching for footprints, discarded items, or any other signs of his presence. The uneven terrain made progress slow, and the dense underbrush often obscured their view. Despite their best efforts, the trail seemed to vanish, as though Zen had been swallowed by the mountain itself. The longer they searched, the more the mood among the team shifted. The initial hope sparked by the discovery of the note began to wane, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The forest felt alive, its shadows stretching and shifting in ways that defied explanation. It was as though the mountain was watching, its secrets buried deep within the towering trees and rocky cliffs. By the end of the day, the searchers regrouped at the campsite, their progress hindered by the lack of new clues. The note, while significant, provided no clear direction for where to search next. The realization that they were no closer to finding Zen weighed heavily on them. The mountain, vast and unyielding, seemed determined to keep its secrets hidden. As night fell, the forest descended into darkness, leaving the searchers to wonder what else might be waiting within its depths. The discovery of Zen Tian's note and campsite on Tia Mountain had brought a semblance of clarity to the search, but the breakthroughs that followed would plunge the investigation into an unsettling realm. The mountain, already shrouded in mystery, began to reveal secrets far darker than anyone had anticipated. The searchers, driven by a mixture of hope and determination, continued to comb the area around the campsite. It was during one of these sweeps that the first chilling discovery was made. A searcher, retracing their steps near the edge of a rocky cliff, noticed something unusual hanging from the branch of a tree. The object, a pair of gray sweatpants, seemed out of place in the otherwise natural setting. As the searcher approached, they saw that the pants had been deliberately tied to the branch, as though placed there intentionally. When the searcher reached up to examine them more closely, they were startled to see a cascade of small white objects falling to the ground. Upon inspection, these objects were revealed to be human bones. The discovery of the bones sent shockwaves through the search team. The sweatpants, carefully tied to the tree, hinted at a macabre purpose. However, initial examinations determined that the bones did not belong to Zen Tian. Instead, they were the remains of an unidentified individual. The implications of this finding were deeply troubling. It suggested that the mountain might hold more than just the mystery of Zen's disappearance. Encouraged by this grim lead, the searchers intensified their efforts in the vicinity of the discovery. What they found over the next several days would turn Tia Mountain into a sight of horror. Scattered throughout the area, they uncovered more human remains. In total, 10 sets of skeletal remains were found, some stuffed into clothing and tied to trees, others hidden in caves or lying at the base of cliffs. Each discovery added to the growing sense that something sinister was at work on the mountain. The recovered remains presented a puzzle as complex as it was disturbing. While a few of the bodies were eventually identified through DNA testing, the circumstances of their deaths remained unclear. None of the remains showed conclusive evidence of trauma, leaving investigators to speculate whether the individuals had succumbed to accidents, exposure, or something more sinister. The body's unusual placement, some suspended in trees, others concealed in remote locations, hinted at a deliberate act, but the lack of clear evidence left their deaths shrouded in ambiguity. For the families of the identified individuals, the discovery brought both closure and a new kind of torment. They had answers to the question of where their loved ones had gone, but not to the question of why. For the searchers, the focus on Zen's disappearance became intertwined with this broader, darker mystery. The mountain, once a place of natural beauty, had become a grim monument to lives lost and stories untold. The unease surrounding Tia Mountain deepened as hikers and locals began sharing their own accounts of strange experiences on its trails. One story, recounted by a seasoned hiker, described an encounter with a man carrying an axe. The man had approached the hiker with an unnerving question, repeatedly asking if they were alone. The hiker, unnerved by the interaction, had quickly left the area without looking back. Others spoke of seeing shadowy figures among the trees, groups of people standing motionless in the distance, or hearing whispers in the otherwise silent forest. While these accounts could not be verified, they painted a picture of a place that seemed to defy logical explanation. Some speculated that the mountain was home to a cult, its members responsible for the deaths and disappearances. Others suggested the presence of a deranged individual or individuals, preying on hikers who ventured too far off the beaten path. There were even whispers of supernatural forces, with the mountain itself cast as a malevolent entity that ensnared those who dared to enter its domain. The search for Zhen Tian, once a straightforward effort to locate a missing hiker, had now become part of a larger and far more chilling investigation. The 10 sets of remains unearthed near his campsite posed more questions than answers. If Zen had encountered whatever or whoever was responsible for these deaths, what had happened to him? Had he fallen victim to the same fate, or had he escaped, only to disappear elsewhere? As the days passed, the search teams began to feel the weight of the mountain's secrets pressing down on them. The discoveries had transformed Tia Mountain into a place of dread, its quiet forests and jagged cliffs now steeped in suspicion and fear. Each new clue seemed to deepen the mystery, pulling the searchers further into a labyrinth of unanswered questions. Despite the grim findings, the search for Zhen Tian continued. His note, the trail of newspapers, and the campsite were tangible evidence of his presence, but they offered no indication of what had ultimately befallen him. The forest seemed determined to hold its secrets, leaving searchers to grapple with the unsettling reality that Zen's fate, and the truth of what lurked on Tia Mountain, might never be fully uncovered. The shadows lengthened, the forest grew darker, and the mountain stood silent, offering no answers to the questions that now haunted all who dared to search. As the search for Zhen Tian continued, the mounting discoveries and unanswered questions transformed the narrative into something far beyond a simple missing person case. Tia Mountain, once regarded as a serene retreat for hikers, had become a site of fear and speculation. The unexplained remains of 10 individuals unearthed in the search, the unsettling stories of hikers encountering mysterious figures, and the eerie stillness of the mountain all combined to paint a picture of an environment both hostile and enigmatic. The search teams pushed forward, driven by the faint hope of finding Zen or at least uncovering definitive evidence of his fate. However, as weeks passed without a trace of him beyond the campsite and the note, the optimism that had carried the search began to fade. The trail, once marked by clear signs like the newspapers tied to trees, had gone cold, leaving searchers with little direction. The mountain seemed to resist their efforts, its dense forests and rocky cliffs serving as a natural barrier against their progress. Despite the lack of new clues, Zen's family refused to give up. His wife and close relatives worked tirelessly, coordinating with authorities and local volunteers to keep the search alive. They placed posters throughout nearby towns and villages, hoping someone might recognize Zen or provide a lead. They also spoke to local media, sharing their story in the hope of keeping the case in the public eye. The outpouring of support from the community was heartening, but it brought no closer answers to the enduring mystery. The villagers near Tia Mountain added their voices to the growing chorus of strange accounts. Some described hearing distant cries echoing through the forest at night, voices that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. Others claimed to have seen lights moving erratically in the distance, as if someone or something was signaling from deep within the woods. These stories, while unverified, added to the sense that the mountain was far from an ordinary place. Speculation about the events surrounding Zen's disappearance ran rampant. Amateur sleuths, online forums, and even seasoned investigators proposed theories ranging from the plausible to the fantastical. Some believed that Zen had fallen victim to a predator, human or animal, lurking in the remote areas of the mountain. Others suggested that he had stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to see, perhaps evidence of illegal activity, and had been silenced as a result. Still, others entertained the possibility of paranormal phenomena, pointing to the inexplicable elements of the case, such as the strange note and the eerie placement of the remains. While theories abounded, the lack of hard evidence left each as speculative as the next. The authorities, stretched thin and unable to dedicate infinite resources to the case, eventually scaled back their efforts. The official search was called off after a month, though the family and a small group of dedicated volunteers continued to explore the mountain in the weeks and months that followed. For them, the absence of a body meant there was still hope, however faint, that Zen might be alive. Tia Mountain, meanwhile, began to draw attention from those curious about its newfound infamy. Adventurers, thrill-seekers, and investigators of the strange began making their way to its trails, hoping to uncover answers or experience the unsettling atmosphere for themselves. Some returned with tales of uneventful hikes, dismissing the mountain's dark reputation as overblown. Others described feeling watched, hearing unexplainable noises, or encountering individuals who seemed out of place. These anecdotes, though varied, served to further enshroud the mountain in an aura of mystery. As time passed, the story of Zen Tian's disappearance began to fade from the headlines, replaced by new tragedies and mysteries. For those who had been close to him, however, the wound remained fresh. His wife clung to memories of his warmth and reliability, struggling to reconcile the man she knew with the inexplicable circumstances of his vanishing. His students, many of whom had been inspired by his love of nature, expressed their sorrow and confusion in letters and messages to his family. The legacy of Zen's disappearance left an indelible mark on Tia Mountain. The site of his campsite became a point of pilgrimage for those intrigued by the case, a physical reminder of the unanswered questions that lingered. The note he left behind, with its cryptic phrasing and strange tone, was preserved as both a clue and a symbol of the mystery that surrounded him. For those who had been involved in the search, the experience remained a haunting memory. The mountain, with its beauty and its darkness, had become a place they could not forget. The searchers often spoke of the feeling that Zen was still there, somewhere in the shadows of the forest, waiting to be found. Yet, despite their efforts, the mountain's secrets remained its own. To this day, the fate of Zen Tian remains unknown. Tia Mountain stands as both a natural wonder and a symbol of mystery, its trails weaving through a landscape that refuses to give up its truths. The questions linger in the minds of those who knew him and those who only heard his story. What drew him to Tia Mountain, and why did he disappear so completely? The answers, if they exist, remain hidden within the mountain's dense forests and silent cliffs, waiting for someone brave enough, or fortunate enough, to uncover them.